Good afternoon, I'm Phil Luke from Luke Corporate Speakers. And this afternoon I'm speaking with motivational speaker Derrick McManus. Derrick, thanks for joining us this afternoon. I really would love to hear from you today about your experience as a South Australian police officer and your involvement in one of the biggest sieges in South Australian criminal history. And importantly, the fact that you were actually shot 14 times during that incident. Can we just set the scene a little bit on what happened that day?
Yeah, beautiful. And thanks for being here. Always great to be in your studio with you. 3rd of May, 1994, so 26 years ago now. But it's still vivid in my mind, as you can well imagine. We had a person who had gone to court the day before this and had failed to reappear in court, and the court issued a warrant for his arrest. Now, we knew this person was a person who was classified as high risk, so they didn't ask the local police to go and arrest him. They asked my section star group, Special Task and Rescue. The special task is high risk arrest, hostage siege, counter-terrorism at the very top end. So we were highly trained in this sort of operation, and we were asked to go and arrest him and bring him to court to answer his charges of fraud.
Now, actually, we have some vision of back on that day.
Yeah, beautiful.
Now, which is part of your show reel.
Yep.
So why don't we play the show reel now, and that'll kind of be a bit of a scene setter for what took place on that momentous day a number of years ago.
Excellent.
Force officer Derrick McManus was on a routine job to arrest a known fraudster, Tony Grosser. What eventuated was, and still is, South Australia's biggest siege. Within minutes of arriving, McManus was gunned down. Over the next 40 hours, 2,000 rounds were fired.
The sound of gunfire was exploding in my ears. I was taking a serious look at the possibility of death, and I was scared. When I'm on stage and I tell people that I've been shot 14 times, you can see them immediately sit up and take notice. From that point forward, I have their total engagement. When we face our greatest challenges and changes in our lives, we essentially have just two choices. And the first choice is to fight for what it is that we want most in life at that particular time. Everyone needs a reason to fight when the going gets tough. When I was lying on the ground for 3 hours, that reason for me was to get back to my children. And that gave me the focus and the determination to fight to live. Lots of people just focus on the challenges of life and forget the opportunities. But it's how we respond to both that determines our future. That's how we build an attitude of true optimism. And it still makes me smile that I can have people cracking up laughing at me being shot 14 times. And the thought that ran through my head was I'd better not shoot myself in the foot, because the guys at work would never let me live it down for the rest of my life. You can just imagine you get shot 14 times and then you shoot yourself as well. I survived and thrived through my challenges because I set myself up physically, mentally and emotionally for durability. And I don't just theorise about these things, I live them as much as I can. I think one of the biggest problems that we have, and we were discussing this just a little bit earlier, is that the hardest thing we have to deal with in life is ambiguity. That not knowing what's the right thing to do, not knowing that if we do this, what's going to happen next. And so we need to take as much of the ambiguity out of life as we possibly can. When you make a choice, you want an outcome. And once we know what that outcome is, we need to check back. Am I making the right choice to get this outcome? I never disregard risk, seriousness or importance. I do some really risky things in my life, but I see myself as a risk manager, not a risk taker, and that's a very clear distinction for me. If we prepare ourselves physically, mentally and emotionally for the challenges in our lives, any challenges, then we can create outcomes by design. Rarely are events in our lives merely good luck or bad luck. We create luck in our life if we choose to do so. When I've engaged and entertained an audience and inspired them to believe in their capacity to achieve more, that's when I know that my job as a speaker has been done. My name is Derrick McManus. I'm a speaker, an author, a facilitator and an MC,
And Derrick, that was a great snapshot of what happened on the day, and of course, you transitioning into becoming one of South Australia's best motivational keynote speakers. We will come to that later, but if we can just drill down a bit more into the actual event and on the day, what as you were approaching that house, what was going through your mind at that point?
Expediency is one of the most important things when you're looking at something that is high risk. So we needed to get in there and get to safe positions as fast as possible. So we drove up to the front door in vehicles, got out of the car. We were well aware that the person that we were interested in was already inside the house. We'd had a marksman observer sitting out in the bush for about the last 20 minutes, just watching the house, watching the offender. So we knew he was inside the house. We got out of the cars, went straight to the house. The sergeant knocked on the front door, called out that we were the police, we wanted to speak to the person inside. There was no answer. At this stage, I've moved down the side of the house towards a glass sliding door, because going through the front door, as we were planning to do, takes time, does damage, exposes us to certain dangers. So I was looking at a second entry point. And as I was moving down the side, the sergeant was knocked again, called again, and again there was no answer. At this stage, I've moved up to this glass sliding door to see if it was open, and as I got to within about 2 feet of the sliding door, the person inside started to shoot, and I was the target. He fired 18 times in less than 5 seconds with a semi-automatic, high-powered Chinese military assault rifle, and he hit me 14 times in less than 5 seconds.
Can I ask, just for the ordinary person, what does that physically feel like?
You know, it's always fascinating when I get to answer that question, because I don't think you can actually say, this is what it feels like to be shot. I can tell you what my experience was, but I think everybody has a different experience. My experience was that all I first knew was that I was starting to fall to the ground. I hadn't felt any impact, hadn't felt any pain, hadn't heard the sound of gunfire. All I knew was I was falling to the ground, and I was cursing myself. How could I be this stupid to be falling? And as I was falling, I looked at the glass sliding door as I was halfway to the ground, and there were small round holes that hadn't been there before. And then I heard the sound of gunfire. Still hadn't felt any impact, still hadn't felt any pain, and I realised, small round holes, sound of gunfire, I must be falling because I'm getting shot. It was while I was lying on the ground that he was still firing at me, and 2 bullets hit my left thigh. Now, they weren't painful when they hit me, but I remember the impacts. But time slowed down. 18 bullets in less than 5 seconds. These 2 seemed to take about 30 seconds to hit me, have their effect, and time to move on. And I felt the impact. The first one hit me, and it was like a sledgehammer just driving into my thigh. And then a shockwave has gone all the way up through my body, and my body's lifting and writhing off the ground. And then that shockwave, I felt it pass back down through my body. And this is much the same as a ripple in a bath. When you step into a bath, and ripple goes to one end to the other, and then it comes back down. Shockwave passed back down, and then I felt the individual second impact, and again it's that sledgehammer. Shockwave up, shockwave back down. So the pain was not painful for me. It was just acknowledgement that something had hit me. And for the next...
Could you move? Were you able to? Were you conscious enough to be able to move to try to get to safety at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I did was I fired back when I felt him hitting me, and I rationalised enough. And this is all within 5 seconds. When I'd rationalised enough that I'm actually being shot, I need to fire back. I was able to fire back at him. I consciously wanted to fire back 6 or 7 times. It was dark inside the house, so I couldn't see the offender, but I could hear where the sound of gunfire was coming from. And so I just fired back in that direction. And I consciously wanted to fire back 6 or 7 times. But as you know, we've got the footage of the shooting. That was analysed by the DSTO, Department of Transport Science organisation, and they analysed it. And it turns out that I'd actually fired 13 times, not 6 or 7, so I just got a little bit excited on the day. But I did fire back. When I fired back, he stopped and he tried to move to safety, which is what I wanted.
So I suppose at this point you were in a fight or flight situation. You obviously had to protect yourself at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something that I talk about to people about where our mind sits. When our emotions and our rational thinking sit on an even plane, everything's calm, everything's predictable, everything's going exactly the way you want it. You can plan, you can contemplate, you can debate, you can do whatever you want because everything's calm. When your emotions go high and you start getting overwhelmed by lack of control or there's things happening that's bigger than you think, when your emotions go high, the rational thinking goes low. And this is where the fight and flight kicks in. You don't do what's smartest, you do what's easiest. However, my training allowed me to overcome that fight and flight very, very quickly and bring the rational thinking back up because I brought the emotion back down. Now, it didn't get back to even, but it got closer. So I was able to put certain things in place that I knew I needed to. So I was certainly in this moment where I was being shot and time was completely overwhelmed, rational thinking was really low. But then as soon as I started thinking about what do I do, my training kicked back in, and I knew that I needed to fire back. Now, one of the stories that people find quite interesting is that I was so well trained, so relaxed with what I needed to do, that I was actually able to have thoughts outside the square while still being able to do everything I needed to do. So as I was lining up to fire back, I realised that I was lying on my back and my feet were pointing directly at where the shooter was. And so as I was lining up, I realised that as you're lying on your back, your feet are actually pointing up. And I realised I needed to get up just a little bit, just to shoot over the top of my feet. But I've got a flak vest on, and that's a bulletproof vest, as people know them, flak vest, weaponry equipment on my upper body. So my upper body's fairly heavy. And as I've lifted my upper body up, my feet have come up to counterbalance. And the thought that ran through my head was I'd better not shoot myself in the foot because the guys at work will give me stick for the rest of my life. Now, that's exactly what I thought on the day. It wasn't overwhelm, it wasn't denial of what was going on for me. It's exactly the way I was thinking because I was so well trained that I was able to think outside the square while still doing everything I needed to do. So absolutely focused, but able to have those peripheral thoughts, and yeah.
So was it at that point that obviously you were shot seriously,
Yep.
And seriously injured? Was it at that point where you collapsed?
No. When I fired back, he stopped. I then rolled to my right a couple of times. I managed to get up to my feet, despite the injuries I had, and I'll describe those for you in just a moment. Doctors are amazed that I was actually able to stand, let alone walk, and it was more of a stagger, but I moved about 6 or 7 metres, and after that 6 or 7 metres, my legs actually started to grow weak because of the injuries, the pain, and the shock, and the loss of blood. I then collapsed to my knees, and I crawled along on my knees, looking for somewhere safe to hide. Body became weaker again, and my legs wouldn't hold me, so I felt my hands and my knees and crawled along on my hands and knees for another 2 or 3 metres. And at that point, I collapsed to the ground, I rolled onto my back, and that's essentially where I stayed for about the next 3 hours.
Now, one of South Australia's leading trauma doctors came to your rescue, in effect. If you can tell me about...
Dr. Bill Griggs.
Yes.
Dr. Bill Griggs, absolute legend. The people who he was working with, the paramedics, the nurses he was working with, absolute legends. So Bill Griggs was flown in. Obviously, the siege went for 3 hours. He was flown in during this 3 hours with his extraction team, or part of the extraction team. And my guys brought me out to him eventually. And when he got to me, he said that I wasn't breathing, I wasn't making any sound, there was no colour and there was no movement, and he thought I was actually dead already. And he was actually willing to say, no, there's nothing we can do for him. He then describes that I took this last gasping breath and there was a flicker of my eyelid. And he said, well, we may as well at least take a look. Now, people find it interesting that I describe it that way because I say, thanks for taking a look. But what he was doing at that time was bullets were flying around his ears. He was standing in direct line of fire from where the shooter was. And so he wasn't just making an assessment, should I try and save this guy or not? It was an assessment, do I risk my life to save this guy's life? Do I risk the lives of my team and the Star Group officers who are standing around to save this guy's life? So this is why I say he's a legend, and the team that he was working with are legends as well. because they put their lives on the line. They stood in direct line of fire for 10 minutes to stabilise me, fill me full of blood again, and then be able to move me away.
So obviously, miraculously, you survived the trauma of that shooting. Just briefly describe for me what your rehabilitation was like after that point, because obviously this was a very traumatic event for you, not only physically,
Yep.
but also, I'm assuming, emotionally and mentally as well.
Yeah, psychologically. So in my mind, there were two aspects to the recovery, the rehabilitation. One was the physical and one was the psychological. And both were major obstacles to get under control. The physical was certainly the first one, get me into hospital, stabilise me, close all the wounds, damage, repair all the bones that were broken. And my rehabilitation was challenging. It took 2.5 years. It first started obviously in hospital with just physiotherapists coming in and moving my body, moving my limbs, because every limb was affected. My torso was affected. And so it was a major exercise to get me moving again. But I remember sitting in hospital about 10 days after the shooting, and the surgeon was coming in to see me, and I said, when will I be able to start walking again? Because I hadn't taken any steps, I hadn't been out of bed. Now I was still in major pain and having major medication to manage that pain, but I said to him, when can I start walking again? One of the injuries that I had was my right Achilles tendon, and that was severed, 80% severed, 20% was still holding together. And he said, Derrick, because of that Achilles tendon, you need to be able to get your foot into just the right place so that you won't stretch it, overstretch it and break it. And that's going to take you at least another 2.5 weeks before you can do that. And I was able to say that day, well, the physios have already got my foot into that place, so when can I take my first steps? And he's gone, well, I guess you can take them today. So my approach to my rehabilitation was always trying to find out what I needed to do next and then working towards it. And generally I found that I was reaching goals faster than what the physios expected me to, the surgeons were expecting me to, or anybody. And it's not because I was anything miraculous, it was just I was really keen, I was really enthusiastic, absolutely passionate about getting myself back to as fit as I possibly could, as quickly as I could. And it wasn't about going back to Star Group or going back to work. I had 4 children at the time. My only goal was to be able to enjoy my life as much as possible with those children. All I wanted to really do was be able to run and hop and skip and jump with my children so we can enjoy life together. Anything further than that was always going to be a bonus. But as you know, 2.5 years after the shooting, highs, lows, achievements, disappointments, there were tears, there were questions in my mind, will it ever be good enough? Will I ever get back there? 2.5 years of it. But I made it back to Star Group. Full duties, no restrictions.
That must have been a very reassuring moment for you that day, that you took that first step back into your career, because you effectively overcame the odds in a major way. You didn't let someone else dictate how you were going to live your life.
Yep.
You decided that you had a path to go down, and that was a path of recovery, and certainly not only on a physical and emotional aspect, but also as a path of recovery for your career. So you went back into the police force and then served for how many years after that point?
I actually only retired 18 months ago. So I was shot in 1994, so it's now 2020. So that would have been another 14 years after the shooting. The other aspect of the recovery is also the psychological, and the psychological seems to astound more people than the physical. Certainly they're amazed that I was able to get back physically, and that defied many odds, as you said. It was predicted that I wouldn't walk properly, let alone run and hop and skip and jump, let alone getting back into the police, let alone getting back into Star Group. So defied many, many odds there. But just 5 days after the shooting, while I was still in hospital, I threw my hand in there and said, get me a psych. I want to talk to a psych. It wasn't because I thought I was weak or I had something wrong. This comes back to what I talk about on stage these days, and it's about mental wellness, mental strength, mental agility, and mental power to be able to manage our mind, not control our mind, but manage our mind. And so 5 days after the shooting, I've gone, get me a psych. Now you can imagine everybody thought he's going to be in therapy for decades. But I was able to talk to the psych just 3 months after being shot. We had about a 3-hour meeting, and I picked his brains about what might I experience in the future? What might I be expected to have to deal with? And who's dealt with it well? Who's dealt with it badly? What's the difference? What could I put in place to give myself best chance of success? He certainly picked my brain about what I was thinking, how I'd planned, how I'd got through this, why I was still able to make jokes at the moment and be light-hearted, but still taking everything very seriously. And in that meeting, 3 hours, just 3 months after the shooting, he cleared me psychologically to go back to work the next day. And I never needed to come back and see him again unless I wanted to. Now, this has astounded so many psychologists and psychiatrists because it's just not normal.
Well, I think it certainly says something about your strength of character and your determination to have that control over your life, that you call the shots, basically.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That's the thing. And of course, you transitioned from not only just going back into your policing career, but you transitioned into becoming one of South Australia's most in-demand and successful motivational speakers. So you've taken your message certainly to lots of different organisations and schools, and into the corporate world and into the conference world as well. Tell me, what are the themes that you speak about today?
So the main theme that I speak about today is human durability, and that's about going beyond resilience to sustaining optimal performance. So it is about resilience because there's a resilience model in there. You've actually got to transition to resilience before you can get to durability. So there's a big focus on actually how to be resilient. But it's about going beyond that. It's not about waiting for things to happen and then having to bounce back. It's about how do we actually sustain optimal performance? How can we anticipate what we might experience and then have plans in place that if we see indicators that tell us it's going well or it's going badly, we will put those things in place immediately. Lots of people talk about having flexibility in our life and flexibility in our response. I like to think about agility. Rather than flexibility, let's be agile. Let's know exactly what we need to do, and when we see the indicator that tells us it's going well or badly, let's respond immediately and be agile, put it in place, and mitigate the negatives, avoid them altogether, or manage them the best way we can.
Do you think that those themes that you're describing there now are what you were subconsciously thinking on that fateful day back in the 1990s when you were shot at that siege? Do you think that you had those messages in play in your mind as it was at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that is the reason I survived. I believe that's the reason I defied the odds physically and psychologically after that shooting. I'm able to articulate exactly discussions that I had with my wife. And I call them open, honest, confronting conversations. And those are the things that we need to have about the reality of what we're going to experience. And then once we have those conversations, we prepare ourselves for them. And there's two levels of comfort that come out of having those open, honest, confronting conversations. One is, let's have a conversation about it. And if you think about committee meetings where we have an elephant in the room, everybody knows that this is what the committee is talking about, but we're all avoiding it. That's the ones that are the open, honest, confronting conversations about reality. And there's two levels of comfort. The first one is, let's talk about it, okay? And do we have the resources? Do we have the finances? Do we have the expertise? Do we have the people in place to be able to manage it? And if you actually go, actually we do, you can now move forward confidently rather than tentatively, we still haven't spoken about this, so let's hope it doesn't come up. No, we know we can handle it. Let's go forward really, really confidently. The second level of comfort is to say, actually, if that does happen, it will destroy us. We don't have the finances, we don't have the people, we will suffer too much. So let's comfortably move away from it and take a different track. Doesn't mean you don't do it, but let's prepare differently for it. But we do that comfortably and confidently as well. But you've got to talk about that elephant. So my example for this is a conversation I had with my wife about, I went into Star Group, and my conversation was, I may be shot and injured, I may be shot and killed. Now that may affect me, but the question I want to ask her was, what's your life going to look like if I die? how will you be able to manage that? And then once we'd had that discussion, it's, are you still comfortable to support me going into this job? So we certainly had that conversation and that agreement that she was. But once I'd had that conversation with her about the reality, I may be killed, I then went away and had that conversation with myself. If I do get shot, what would I expect of myself as an optimal performance in that situation? And this is a really important aspect. It's not what would be my peak performance, because peak performance when you've been shot or in any other catastrophe is impossible. You can't perform at your peak. But what is optimal? Now, I worked out that if I got shot, absolute optimal would be at one end of continuum where I only had a small injury, I was able to manage it all, able to get help and assistance, A, B, C, D, absolutely perfectly. But what would it look like if it was absolute chaos and I had no control? It was major injuries, which is where I was. And I had a contingency in place for that. And that's when I started getting that overwhelm as I was being shot. And I'd prepared myself so well that I knew I needed to fire back, but I was also able to have that thought just that little bit outside the square about what are the guys going to say if I shoot myself in the foot. You know, you get shot 14 times and then you shoot yourself in the foot as well. But I was able to have that thought, still do exactly what I needed to do. But that's because I'd had that open conversation with myself.
And you've got a couple of slides there that we can use to illustrate.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we bring the first one up there, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the mindset, because this is the mindset that I had well and truly before. I didn't know it at the stage, at that stage, and it's not until afterwards that I actually realised that this is what worked for me. So it's about stay strong, find the system, work the system, and then tweak the system. Staying strong physically, mentally, and emotionally. And this is about being passionate about what you want to do, knowing exactly what you need to do, want to do, and be absolutely focused on it. So in a model for durability in the programs that I run, there is a model and it starts out with that vision. And that vision is absolutely essential, and that sets up your mindset. That is staying strong physically, mentally, emotionally to achieve that. Then you've got to find a system. And the system is the system that works for you. Lots of people come to me and say, Derrick, how did you do it? What can we now learn? How can we do it the same way as you did it? And I say, well, you can't do things the same way I did it. You can do it similar, but you'll always have your own stamp. Now, there are ways that work for me that won't work for you, Phil. They won't work for the people in the room doing the filming with us. They won't work for all my audience, but they'll give them some insights into what they can do. Some people go, no, that's a system for me, I'm going to use it. Sensational. And some people say, I'd like to tweak it and just put that around there. Sensational. It's the system that works for you. There are ways that we do things in our lives that have helped us in the past. We've got to reflect on what are those systems and bring those systems in.
And the second slide we've got here, let's just bring that up if we can as well, and let's talk about that.
Okay, so that's the continuum,
yes. The
human durability continuum. And as you can see, it starts out with fragility on one end, resilience in the middle, and durability on the other end. Fragility is when we're brand new. When you start a new sport, a new career, a new job, a new system of doing anything in your life, we're fragile. We're new, we're learning, we're wanting to gain experience. It's a trial and error period. We're fragile, we're making mistakes. And you can picture this, anybody coming into a new job. And it's that gaining experience that we really want. And once we get enough experience and we have good guidance, good coaching, good mentoring, somebody to teach us, and we have lots of good experience, we're able to move along from fragility to resilient. Now, resilient is the point where we are able to sit back and say, no problems, I've got it. If there's a problem, I know how to solve it. We are problem solvers in resilience, right? And that's a good position to be. It's a very, very powerful position to be. But it means you're still waiting around for things to happen and then go, no. If that's broken, I know how to fix it, or I'll work it out. You're still reactive. Durability is a much more proactive attitude. And it's where we're more confident, we're courageous, we're willing to take calculated risks, and we're able to grow in ourselves. And durability is about being able to anticipate what the problems might be, knowing what the indicators are that tell us it's going well or it's going badly, and then having plans in place that we can just go, let's go to plan B, let's go to plan D, let's go to plan Z. instantly, depending on what the indicator is. And those are the people who stay calm in the middle of absolute chaos. These are the CEOs that come in, everybody else is running around, what do we do, what do we do? And the CEO just walks through and just goes, we need to do that, we need to do that. And everybody's going, how can he be so calm? Because he knows what to do. He has had a look at those issues and he is prepared for them. A lot of people say to me, Derrick, you prepared for getting shot 14 times. I didn't prepare for being shot 14 times, but I prepared for being shot. But they say, that's not reality for me, how can I relate to it? I talk to people about being able to prepare themselves for the challenges they can experience in their lives as a result of the choices that they made for themselves. I made choices to put myself in police, into Star Group, and into this situation where we were arresting a guy that we knew was high risk. I needed to prepare myself for that life because that's the life I chose. If I'm talking to CEOs, if I'm talking to kids in the schoolyard, if I'm talking to plumbers, electricians, if I'm talking to bankers, brokers, whatever they might be, I get to know the client, I get to find out what their challenges are, what they can realistically expect to encounter, and then we build up case scenarios where we go through their actual issues and apply the model.
And that was my question. How do you approach different clients with the messages that you have?
It's about sitting down with them, and whether it's a one-on-one personal client or it's a corporate client where I'm speaking at an event or I'm running a workshop, we sit down together and we actually talk about their business, about their experiences, what their challenges are, what experiences have they had in the past, what are they anticipating they're going into? Are they going into a phase of growth? Are they dealing with, the COVID environment that we are now? What is it that they're trying to achieve at the moment? What is their vision? So what is the vision? What's the outcome they want as a result of me being there? And then we put it all into place to give them the results that people can relate to.
So this is not all about Derrick McManus being shot as a policeman. This is much more. Your presentations are much more than that.
I kind of try to put the shooting itself as secondary. It's a really great example of how this system worked for me. It's a really great way for people to be engaged, and I love telling the story. You can tell I like telling stories, but it is secondary to what I do with human durability. That's the outcome I want. I want people to be having optimal performance for themselves, being more resilient, being more confident, having a mindset where their mental wellness is about being mentally stronger, more agile, more adaptable to environments, and certainly building that optimal performance for themselves in their own life or in their business. It's available to everybody. We do it on and as I sit down with clients, I'll explain this in more depth. We actually use my model on a daily basis, but we use it for everyday life. And when it comes to the extremes, we think to ourselves, well, I can't use the stuff that I do every day. This is an extreme. No, we just take this model and extrapolate it and apply it to here. But it's about having those open, honest, confronting conversations about the elephant in the room, the real risks as a result of our own choices, and then putting a model behind it that gives us the ability to consciously, deliberately put a plan in place that gives us the best chance of having an outcome by design, rather than hoping, wishing, praying that everything will fall into place. Oh, wait until it happens because we'll work it out. Let's see how it goes on the day. No, not good enough.
Derrick, that's an amazing story. You have an amazing story and very well articulated. Thanks for joining me this afternoon, and I'm sure that when we get post this COVID crisis, that there will be many more events that you will be able to convey your message to many audiences, not only here in South Australia, but around Australia. So thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Phil, always a pleasure working with you, as you know. Absolutely love it. Thanks for having me here today.